But now let's bring in MS Now Elections and Analytics Director Kabir Khanna, his first visit to Money Power Politics. He's at the big board this morning. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Let's break things down. I want to go to Florida and Alaska first because everybody is looking for this one definitive picture. And we're not getting one. Tell us what we saw.
Yeah, let's talk about some key Senate races. So we'll start here in Florida. This was a very interesting race last night. As you mentioned, Angie Nixon, a progressive state representative from the Jacksonville area, she beat Alex Vindman decisively. What's interesting about this is that Vindman had a national profile. He was backed by a lot of establishment leaders in the Democratic Party. And Vindman outspent Nixon by a ratio of over 10-1. Despite that, Nixon really ran up the score. You can see it in a lot of the populous counties in Florida, like Miami-Dade and Broward. And it ended up being not that close. When the first votes came in last night, it looked like a 50-50 race. Then the election day votes started reporting, and Nixon's lead opened up into a very wide margin. What I want to say about Florida is a lot of people think of it as a bellwether or a swing state. Really, since 2020, this state has shifted to the right. It voted for Donald Trump by double digits. Nixon's going to be running against the sitting senator, Ashley Moody. This is going to be a tough race. We currently view the Senate race and the general election as a likely Republican race. But let's talk about Alaska, because when one door starts to close, another door sometimes starts to open. And we have some news here. So Alaska has an interesting system where all registered voters vote in the same primary. And then the top 4 vote getters from that primary advance to the general election. Well, 2 important candidates who advanced were Mary Peltola, the Democrat, and the incumbent Senator Dan Sullivan. We saw a very even electorate in terms of party registration, in terms of the primary, and Peltola ended up the top vote getter. What we now say about Alaska is this is a toss-up race in the general election. The data suggests that this will be very competitive. And what it means is that Democrats have a path to reclaiming the Senate majority that runs through Alaska and the other toss-up states, Stephanie.
Kabir, thank you so much. Let's get smarter with the help of our leadoff panel and decide what all of this means. Michael Schnell is here, MS Now congressional reporter, Luke Broadwater, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House correspondent for The New York Times, and my dear friend Leanne Caldwell, chief Washington correspondent for Puck. Okay, Leanne, let's start down in Florida. As I said to Kabir, this is a mixed picture when it comes to these primary results, right? Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Jared Moskowitz, clearly incumbents. They won, but so did Angie Nixon over Alex Vindman. What do you think that tells us?
Well, it tells us one thing, that Vindman wasn't that great of a candidate. I've heard from from sources who's in Florida who say that he wasn't really running that great of a campaign, and that
he had the money.
He did have a lot of money, but you still have to connect with voters. And so candidates absolutely matter. That's one thing that it is saying. The other is Moskowitz in his district, when he beat the DSA candidate, he ran a really aggressive campaign. So it's a relatively, kind of new district with redistricting for him, but he's relatively well known in the area. And so candidates do matter. But what I will say, when it comes to a general election, Moskowitz is going to have a difficult race. His seat is now more Republican because of this gerrymander. And when it comes to the statewide race in the Senate, it's interesting because Democrats were eyeing Florida as a possible long shot pickup seat if the map became a real blue wave. But that was when they were anticipating that Vindman was going to win. So now it could change the dynamics a bit. And it's going to be interesting to see if Democrats think that and national Democrats decide to actually play in the race. There's a lot of unknowns right now. And as my colleague Peter Hamby at Puck reported just last night in an exclusive polling that we got our hands on, that the Democratic base is pretty enthusiastic about DSA candidates. But when it comes to the broader electorate, that completely flips, with a very small percentage, under 30% of voters, who are supportive of these candidates. And so it's always going to be a much harder chore for some DSA candidates when they have to face a wider electorate, especially in a red state like Florida.
The primaries versus the general. That's the $1 million question, Michael. Then to you, What are Nixon's chances, right? Is this Florida Senate seat actually in play with her as the candidate? She's got a huge amount of enthusiasm.
Right. But, Florida has been a state that used to be one of those battleground states. In recent years, it has trended more red. I think that what makes this interesting is Ashley Moody as the Republican nominee. She was appointed to the seat by the governor to continue after Marco Rubio was confirmed as Secretary of State. But she's not somebody that has that well known of a profile. She doesn't take any questions in the Capitol. That is her standard rule. No questions in the hallways. So I think that folks thought that maybe Vindman, given that he had a higher national profile or was believed to have a higher national profile, would have a better chance of taking out Ashley Moody. But now with this candidate like Nixon in there, it's going to be that question that you just asked. A DSA candidate may be able to win a primary. That may work when you're debating among Democratic voters. But when you're in a red state and a battleground state where more of a moderation can be better, I think that a lot of Floridians are wondering, Democratic Floridians, that they had an opportunity with Ashley Moody being maybe not the strongest candidate for a general election cycle. But then when you bring in somebody like Nixon, well, a DSA candidate, how will that fare in a state like Florida?
Well, in less than 80 days, we're about to find out. All right, let's talk about Trump, Luke, because he endorsed two candidates in Florida and they both lost. This is now his home state. What does that say about where Republican voters are right now? I think back, I talked to President Trump, I don't know, maybe 3-4 months ago. I wasn't even asking him about endorsing candidates. He went out of his way to tell me about the golden touch he has. He's so good at endorsing candidates. He was then endorsing them internationally in other countries, helping people win. And he had an almost 100% hit ratio, not in his home state.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump likes to say he's undefeated in endorsing candidates, but he never includes all the candidates that he backed that lost, right? Those somehow magically fall off the list. He does have a generally pretty good record in Republican primaries. If you look at it big picture, it does seem that the Republican electorate generally over the years has agreed with him on primary candidates. But there are a fair number of losses in there, too, that he doesn't like to acknowledge. I do think some of these races show the limits of scandal, right? Maybe Donald Trump has proven to be scandal-proof in Republican politics, but those don't extend to other candidates like a Corey Mills, like an Andy Ogles. So some of these House members who encounter scandal don't have sort of the same bulletproof charisma that Trump has in these primaries.
Leanne, here's the thing, though. Donald Trump is now the establishment, right? When he ran in 2015, 2016, he was the anti-Washington, right? He was draining the swamp. It was the elites versus us. Now he's the most elite person maybe our government has ever seen, and he's surrounded by the wealthiest cabinet, the wealthiest administration we have ever seen in modern history.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there's actually a huge anti-establishment streak running through a lot of these primaries on both sides of the aisle. I was just talking to a Democratic operative the other day who was really trying to suss out how this anti-establishment streak is going to impact each party in the general election. And Trump is the establishment now. And when you talk about, you called him an elite, this issue of corruption and enriching himself in the office is starting to show up in a lot of polling as well, where corruption for the first time, maybe since the Nixon era, that corruption is really becoming a concern for voters. And so, he has, as Luke said, a pretty good record in primaries. But the big question now is what happens in the general election. I was down in South Carolina a couple of weeks ago covering the Republican primary before it went to a runoff. And I was talking to Republicans down there, and they said that the Trump endorsement for Darlene Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham's sister, South Carolina Republicans saw it like it was indifferent. It didn't really help her, they don't think. And so it's a really big test. It's especially going to be a big test for her when this runoff on Tuesday. So, the Trump power in a primaries is a mixed bag these days, and it could be an even more mixed bag heading into the general stuff.
You know what else didn't help her, Leanne? The debate she was in last night. Yeah. Let's talk about Alaska. How does this Senate race shape up, Michael?
Well, it's good news for Mary Peltola that she came in first, but the way that, and then Dan Sullivan, the incumbent senator, coming in second, but the way that Alaska conducts its primaries, it's a top 4 nonpartisan primary system, which means that the top 4 vote getters, regardless of party, are going to advance to the general election. So the juggernaut here, and the big question here, is that second, Sullivan Jr., the other Dan Sullivan running in this race, he's in third place right now, which means that he is likely going to move on to the runoff, which brings up a big question of, does that siphon votes away from the incumbent Dan Sullivan, which is something that Republican lawmakers are very, very concerned about, especially when you're talking about a place like Alaska, of what we've spoken about is so key and critical to who controls the Senate next year. Now, in the general election, Alaska uses a ranked choice system, which means that voters will rank 1, 2, 3, 4 of those 4 candidates who they prefer, and then so over and so forth. So certainly Republicans have a lot of ground they need to make up here, particularly with that added problem and added wrinkle of having another Dan Sullivan on the ballot. But right now it looks good for Democrats, given that Peltola came in first. And it's worth noting she has experience winning statewide in the past. Back in 2022, she won her race to be in the House to represent Alaska. But Alaska is a state that only has one representative in the House, which means that the entire state that wins. So this is going to be a very critical and very interesting race, particularly with the fact that you have ranked choice voting, which is very hard to predict, and the fact that you have 2 guys from the same party who are going to be running against each other with the same exact name.